I am Sam Freedman. I am Exec Director of Programmes at Teach First. I was formerly, though, a policy advisor at the Department for Education, which is why I chose this topic to talk to you about, how to influence politicians and policymakers. I am hoping that we can have a bit of a discussion at the end, a bit of Q&A. If we don't have any questions, then I'm going to tell you about what happens when Article 50 is triggered and the Canadian-Europe trade agreement. So I would strongly suggest that you come up with some questions, or I'm going to bore you on that topic. But before we get to that, I've got 5 sort of tips that I wanted to talk to you about around this topic: how do you influence politicians and policymakers. The first tip is do your homework. A lot of people who aren't particularly involved in policy, who haven't spent much time in or around Westminster, think of the government as being a sort of single entity, a single block that makes decisions, usually bad ones that make your life more miserable, and we don't really understand how it functions, how it works. Actually, politics is and the world of policymaking it consists of multiple different power blocks, a network between them, and they all have different status at different times and different relationships between them. And you need to understand what that looks like and what that network looks like at any given time if you really want to make a dent in that network, if you want to understand who you need to influence about what. So you need to understand who has the power to make the change that you want and who has influence over them. So just to give out a few power blocks within education, because that's what we're going to be focusing on. You've obviously got a Secretary of State, you've got junior ministers, you've got special advisors, you've got policy advisors, you've got the strategy team, you've got the permanent secretary, you've got senior civil servants, you've got number 10, you've got the treasury. They will all have their own view on what is right. And they often won't agree with each other very much about what is right. And what they have control over will differ from time to time. So right now, I could spend, I'm not going to, don't worry, I could spend the next half hour setting out what that network looked like in quite a lot of detail. Who is who, what do they all do, who's important, who has whose ear. But you may have noticed there's a referendum today. Whichever way that goes, the result could lead to all that changing in a few weeks. We could have a new Secretary of State, we could have different advisors, we could have a new Prime Minister, and the interactions between all those people will look different again. So you really, it's not straightforward, and you really need to understand what that network looks like. However, there are some rules of thumb that broadly speaking apply whoever is in power, but you do need to understand the network as it is. So most of the time, power sits with whoever has the ear of the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Education. And where the Secretary of State doesn't have the ear of the Prime Minister, then often the Secretary of State can be cut out of that picture altogether. So a good example of that would be in the Blair years, when Ruth Kelly was Secretary of State for Education and Andrew Adonis was Tony Blair's advisor. At that point, Andrew Adonis had far more power than Ruth Kelly, and if you wanted to make a difference, if you wanted to influence, you needed to either go to him or somebody who had his ear, rather than going to the Secretary of State. This, broadly speaking, holds. So junior ministers are a really interesting example. Junior ministers are not picked as part of a coherent team. They're picked because whoever is working on the reshuffle is trying to fit the names they have over here onto a panel over here. So often you get departments where the junior ministers and the Secretary of State aren't particularly aligned on issues, but sometimes they are really aligned on issues. So when Michael Gove was Secretary of State, then on at least some issues, talking to Nick Gibb would be a fairly good way of getting a policy change, because he would be given permission by Michael Gove to make that change. Whereas if you looked at some of the coalition setups that existed during the in the last Parliament, a favourite one would be Lynn Featherstone working for Theresa May. You aren't going to get to Theresa May by going to Lynn Featherstone. So you have to understand who has whose ear within those kinds of networks. But broadly speaking, that's the most important. Those two are the two most important people. Again, second rule of thumb, advisors tend to be the most important people in a department after the Secretary of State, and I'm not just saying that because I was one. The junior ministers, as I was saying, tend not to be picked by the Secretary of State, whereas they do tend to pick their advisors. So usually it is the case that advisors have the ear of ministers more than junior ministers or senior civil servants. Usually they're the best people to talk to when you want to try and influence a change in government. Partly because they have the ear of the right people, partly because they have more time to actually instigate a change and to make a difference. So ministers, and particularly secretaries of state, and certainly the Prime Minister, all have insane diaries, as you can imagine. So do advisors, but it's even worse for ministers. They have to do the parliamentary business. They usually want to spend at least one day a week in their constituency. They have endless meetings with people they just have to meet because those people are important, delegation from this country, from that country. They have very, very little time to actually engage with ideas or to think very much about coming up with change themselves. They're usually making decisions based on information that they're being given, and that information is being mediated by advisors. So if you want to get to be mediating that information too, then often advisors are the best people to speak to. Not always, it very much depends on the precise issue that you want to affect. It might be that you want to, you do want to go straight to a junior minister. It might be that you want to, it's actually a non-governmental organisation, institution like Ofsted or Ofqual that you need to talk to, but it's a good rule of thumb. Third rule of thumb, all but the top layer of civil servants have very little power over policy making. They do have power over the technical thing that they're responsible for, but they don't have access to, on the whole, there are some exceptions, they don't have access to ministers. The top civil servants will meet ministers on a very regular basis, and they do have some, again, ability to mediate, but it will very much depend on the relationship that civil servant has with the ministers that they work with. Some civil servants can become very powerful. Jeremy Hayward, who's the Cabinet Secretary, is a very good example of someone who's managed to position himself very well with every Prime Minister since John Major. If you can get in with him, then you've got a very good chance of influencing politicians. But usually within a department, ministers will look to their advisors before their senior civil servants, with some exceptions. If you get down to the junior layer of civil servants, they're so many layers away from ministers that their ability to influence change in policy-making terms is fairly limited most of the time. So often people get very excited about the opportunity to meet with somebody who's working in their area in the Department for Education, but if they're too junior, you won't get very far, and they won't actually be able to engage with you properly because they'll feel very constrained by the limits that have been put on them. Tip 2, make it really simple and easy. So if you manage to get in a room with an advisor or a junior minister or a senior civil servant or somebody that you've decided is going to be able to help you influence the change that you want to make it as simple and easy for them as possible to make that change. So I'm going to give you an example of someone who did this really badly to illustrate how it's not done. When I was working with Michael Gove in opposition in 2009, Robin Alexander turned up with his Cambridge Curriculum Primary Review to talk to us about it, to try and influence us to take on some of those recommendations. He'd already failed to get the government to pay any attention to it at the time, so he was trying to get the opposition to engage. He didn't make any effort whatsoever to make it to make that a simple process. He didn't digest the information. He gave us a massive 500-page book, which no politician is ever going to have time to read. There was no digest of it in the meeting. The meeting, when it happened, was an hour-long rant about why the government wouldn't pay any attention, and was very. It wasn't aimed at it wasn't designed to engage or to help. In this case, a shadow minister to pick up the ideas. So, what do I mean by make it simple? Remember that everybody you're going to meet in a position like that is going to be insanely busy. When I was in the Department for Education, I averaged 300 to 400 emails a day. I had about 30 submissions, which are often about 20 pages long to read or skim. You obviously can't read that much. So you have very, very little time. Ministers have even less. So don't give them anything to read that's longer than 2 pages, 1 page ideally. No one will ever read anything longer than 2 pages. If you want them to write a quote for a social enterprise you're setting up or a book that you're trying to promote, send them the quote. Don't ask them to write a quote. Just send them the quote and get them to agree to it. If you want them to make some introductions to people for you, send them an email with the email that you want to send to the people you're making an introduction to, with a list of the email addresses for the people that you want them to introduce you to. Make everything as simple as possible all the time, because they have no time and they will forget or ignore it, and it will drop to the bottom of their list if you don't make it really, really simple. And the third is kind of related to this, but a slightly larger concept. So you ideally go with the grain of government policy. If you want to have much luck at influencing, you need to think about how the change you want can be framed in a way that fits with the general direction of government policy. If you don't do that, you won't get much of a hearing. So there might be people here who think the government is making an enormously stupid mistake about something to do with the curriculum or assessment. If you go in with that line, which is what Robert Alexander did on the curriculum primary review, you won't get very far. You will be, why would they want to pick up your idea if it's presented as an attack on what they've been doing? You want as much as possible to show how your idea will help them achieve their goals, and in particular, how can the change you want solve a problem that the government has? I'll give you a really good example of this from the last sort of year that I've been helping with a bit. There's a Teach First ambassador, a guy called Graham Duncan, who was in fact the very first person to ever be recruited to Teach First. And he wanted to set up an organisation called Right to Succeed. And he wanted that organisation to do place-based change in areas of the country with high levels of education disadvantage. And the idea was you'd bring lots of charities together. It's happening. You bring lots of charities together and get all their interventions in one school at the same time to try and maximise the effect and really turn around a school and really drive up progress. Now, what he didn't do is go in, when he did manage to secure, having done his homework and secured the meetings with the right advisors, he didn't go in with saying, I've got this idea about place-based change, getting loads of charities together, because it wouldn't have really clicked with politicians. They wouldn't have had any particular objection to it, but they thought, okay, that sounds like a great idea, you go away and do it. He managed to use it to answer some questions that to present it in a way that answers some questions that the government is worried about at the moment. So one thing he did was to build social impact bonds into the model. Now, you may not have heard of social impact bonds, but government is obsessed with social impact bonds because it thinks it's a way to pay for stuff for less money. The idea of a social impact bond is that you get some rich people to give you some money to make your thing happen, and then if success is proven, the commissioner, which in this case would be the government, then pays the rich people back a return. So it's a way of marketising something so that Jesus Christ. So that you only essentially pay for it as government if it's successful. So it's very popular. The Cabinet Office love it. Departments are all being told they have to do it. So he went in and said, I'm going to do this as a social impact bond rather than just give me £5 million to do this. That was very clever because it meant he was solving a problem they had. How do we use these social impact bonds that everyone's obsessed about? The other thing he did was to link it to the government's current obsession with coastal areas. So he said this was going to be a solution for how you can help your cold spots, as they call them in the new white paper. So he said he was going to do it in Blackpool first, which is an area that they're worried about. It ticks a box for them. It's something they can talk about when they're talking about their cold spots strategy. Again, it makes it easy for them, and it makes it something that they would want to sign up to. It still took him a very long time to get through all the different advisors and get all the senior civil servants and eventually ministers signed up, which he managed to do just before the election. And it is now happening in Blackpool. But he wouldn't have stood a chance unless he'd found a way to present that idea in a way that went with the grain and helped government solve a problem that they had. And then tip 4 is use social media to build alliances of support. And I think it's quite hard to overstate how obsessed Westminster is with Twitter. I know that sounds ridiculous, but every single person in Westminster has a Twitter account, even if they're not actively tweeting, and they look at it all the time. And it's because it's the only way they can see what's happening outside of where they are. Yes, they might be visiting schools on occasion. They might, if there's ministers going to be talking in that to constituents. But if you want immediate feedback to a newspaper story or to an idea, a policy that you've just announced, it really is the best way available, even if it can be a bit distorting, to get that information back, to get that kind of feedback. So they are obsessed with it. They look at it all the time, and they're very influenced by it. They're probably more influenced by it than they should be. So you can go a very long way by having a very active profile on social media. And this is a really good route if you don't have that kind of access to ministers and advisors that I was talking about earlier. Great if you can get meetings with advisors, you know someone who can connect you, you can get an introduction, you meet them and persuade them to meet with you, that's fantastic. But obviously a lot of people aren't in a position where they can immediately get those kinds of meetings. If you can't, then this is the best way to start. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The first one related to somebody sitting in the room, which is around Ofsted. And the change that has now happened in Ofsted, and I suspect will be continued when we have our new HMCI, can't happen soon enough, around moving away from assessing teaching and learning, teaching directly, assessing teachers in the classroom and grading them in particular. I certainly wasn't aware of a problem with the idea of grading teachers. It had never come up from any civil servant when I was working in the department. No official meeting had ever raised it with us. It wasn't something that unions were complaining about. But through a fairly sustained Twitter campaign led by Andrew, with lots of other people engaging with it, that did lead to a change in policy. It did lead to grading being taken away. At least they should not be grading anymore. I know that there's still some inconsistent practice. And the reason why that campaign worked was because, again, it was put in a way that appealed to the way that the ministers and advisors at the time were thinking. It was cleverly designed to fit with the direction of government policy rather than to be... It would have been very easy to present a campaign around stop grading teachers as a... we want less accountability. This is mean, this is horrible, it's making teachers stressed, all of which are probably true, certainly true, but none of which would have particularly appealed to government ministers at the time in making them make a change. But those things are all said about league tables and assessment and exams as well, and they haven't made... In fact, they've put in more assessment, and they've gone the other way on that. The thing that made them sit up and pay attention was that it was the critique was phrased in a way that made it seem that the way that Ofsted was behaving was running in direct counterpoint to what the government's new curriculum wanted, essentially. So that they were using teacher grading to make teachers teach in a more progressive way, and or to scare them into thinking they should teach in a more progressive way because of inconsistencies within various inspection reports and what people on What Do Ofsted Want courses were being told, rather than teaching how government ministers would like. So obviously they didn't go the other way. They didn't say Ofsted should tell everyone to teach this way, but by framing it in a way that appealed to the general direction of government policy meant that change happened, even though it had never been proposed by anyone in a position of power. It came from a group of classroom teachers who were campaigning for that change. Another good example where social media really helped change government policy was on GCSEs. These U-turns happen so quickly that you may have forgotten that a couple of years ago, in 2013, there was a plan to change the name of GCSEs to English Baccalaureate Certificates, And there was also a plan to have a single exam board and to make some changes to the GCSE, the way the GCSEs worked. And there were some of us in the department who thought it was not a very good idea to change the name, because changing the name gave the impression that the reform actually was a much bigger and scarier thing than it actually was. And you could just make the change you wanted by making changes to GCSEs. You didn't need to create an entirely new system or give the impression that you were scrapping GCSEs and coming up with a completely new policy. You could just improve what you had and have the same outcome. And I was able to convince ministers to revert back to that and to U-turn. It was the very last thing I did when I was working in the department, because lots of people that they liked and trusted on social media had said more or less the same thing. So I could use their arguments in aid of my own view that that was the right thing to do. And again, there were classroom teachers doing that probably didn't even realise they led to that policy change. But had they not written those blogs and been making those arguments on Twitter, it would have been much harder for me to persuade ministers that it was a good idea to revert back. So it's probably true. You know, there's two really concrete policy changes that happened as a result of social media, and it's probably the case that some of the teachers that led those campaigns had more influence over government policy than some junior ministers did in the last Parliament. So it really is worth engaging on social media. It is worth making the case if you can't get directly in, because people will see it and it will be picked up, and you will get the chance to make your case, albeit indirectly. So that's kind of how you go about trying to influence if you want to be positive, if you want to make friends and influence people, if you want to help them solve a problem they have, if you want to engage in a way that's really constructive and will make them see the light. The alternative, if what you want to happen is really against government policy and they are absolutely not going to listen to you under any circumstances, and there is no point trying to be nice and influence that way, is tip 5, which is just make yourself a complete nightmare, which does sometimes work, but is a high risk option, because once you've tried it, then you're certainly never going to be able to use the other route of influence through getting on with people. However, there have been, over the last, well, in every Parliament, but particularly over the last 6 years, quite a lot of U-turns. And those U-turns are driven by the fact that people have campaigned against things. They have tried to influence, but they've influenced through getting other people to creating enough of an alliance to change policy rather than doing it direct through ministers. And there's some really interesting, I think, sort of lessons around this. And I'm amazed at how little this is understood by people who don't like government policy and want to attack it. There are two things you really need to do to change government policy. You have to go beyond the usual suspects. You can't just have the same people who always shout and complain at the government shouting and complaining, because they're not going to pay any attention to them, because they're not going to win those people over anyway. And if you're not going to win those people over anyway, why would you bother? Why would you care if they didn't like this particular policy? And you also need to keep up sustained pressure over a long time. And a nice example I spotted on the train as I was on the way up is that the NUT have called another one-day strike today. And there will be a strike on the 5th of July. And it will have absolutely no effect on anything. And the reason it will have absolutely no effect on anything is because it won't go beyond the NUT, who the government already know hate them. In fact, it gives them a great opportunity to say these are the enemies of promise again. And it won't be sustained. It's only a day long. So for all the bluster that you'll get in some right-wing papers about the damage that will do to children's education, everyone can cope with a day-long strike. It was quite interesting, actually, that their last attempt to influence government policy around SATs, they did actually make more of an effort to go beyond the usual suspects by trying to generate a parental campaign. It's called an AstroTurf approach, because it's fake grassroots. It was pretty obvious, actually, if you looked into how it was working, that the people behind the parental campaign were very associated with the Anti-Academies campaign and the NUT. But at least it was an attempt to broaden the critique beyond the usual suspects. And it did have some effect. It got more coverage than some of the other attacks have got, but it didn't probably go wide enough and engage enough people to really have that effect. So a good example, recent example of this happening was the U-turn on forcing everyone into academy status. Now, again, obviously, all the usual suspects did have a go at that policy. But the reason there was a U-turn was because local authorities managed to persuade their Tory MPs to attack the policy. And once Tory MPs are attacking the policy, you're making it a lot harder for government to follow through. They also managed to get enough criticism in the more mainstream right-wing press to sort of force ministers to think again. Another really good example of this was just after the Olympics and around school sport. People had been campaigning on school sport for more or less the entire time I was in the department, complaining about cuts, complaining that it wasn't enough of a priority. But the people who'd been running that campaign without a huge amount of success for all that time cleverly used the Olympics in 2012 as a platform to say the government aren't investing enough in sport, so we're not going to retain the legacy of the Olympics. And they got the right-wing press signed up. The Telegraph wrote about it every day. And the Prime Minister eventually wrote to the Secretary of State saying, sort this out, give them what they want, make it go away, because I don't want my Olympics legacy clouded by endless articles about how school sport is going down the drain. So they, again, very cleverly went beyond the usual suspects to create a real problem for the government, and that was what forced a change. And also they'd kept it sustained over a really long period. They just didn't give up. Even someone who goes beyond the usual suspects and gets quite a campaign going against a particular issue, if it doesn't carry on for a long time, won't necessarily be very successful, because you can always ride out one news cycle. You can always ride out 24 hours. Alistair Campbell had a rule that that any minister could survive a crisis, but if it was in the newspapers for more than 11 days, that was it. That was when you were gone, the 11-day rule. We got to 10 days once, which was the Building Schools for the Future. But it died down on day 10, so we were just okay. So again, it needs to be, the Olympics example is a good one, because they kept going all the way through the Olympics, day after day, and it got to the point after sort of a week and a half of it where the Prime Minister said, okay, enough, we've got to make this go away and stop it. If it had been a one-day event that then went away, it could have been the campaign succeeded and they got some money for school sport. I didn't say that it was a good idea, what they were asking for.
Cameron said it was never going to work. We have an Ofsted system which doesn't value extracurricular. It was never going to work. So it's entirely cynical.
Oh yeah, but the campaign were asking for money and they got money, so that was what they were asking for. I never would have, it was a really bad policy, what we ended up with. It was a really stupid policy. It was tiny little bits of money sent to every primary school. What are they supposed to do with that? It's a daft policy, but it was the result of a campaign that had been asking for that. I didn't say every example I was using was a good policy of influence, but it was just ones that had worked. So yes, I'm going to stop there. I've been talking for about half an hour. I wanted to give people an opportunity to ask questions or make comments, tell me I'm wrong about something. Perhaps if there's real life examples of things people want to engage on, then that would be good too. Or I'm going to talk to you about Canada-European trade agreements. So your choice. We'll go one that we'll go there and then there. Yeah?
Quick one from me then. I'm just wondering how London-centric is all this, and if you're outside of the capital, do you have a chance?
Yeah, policy is definitely very London-centric. That's where everyone is, yes, ministers do travel outside of London, but obviously that's where they're based. There has been a bit of an attempt to push it out. DfE do have buildings all around the country, and Ofqual is in Coventry and so on. But in reality, yes, politics is still very, very London-focused. I don't think that means that you're necessarily cut out. It probably means you have to come to London, and you have to, if you really want to meet with people, you usually have to go to them, and that's part of making it simple and easy for people. You can't expect necessarily people to come to you. But again, this is one area where social media has opened it up again, because people who are not in London, you don't have to be at a meeting. You can make your point virtually these days. So I think that has helped a bit. But yes, policy making is very London centric, and that has caused lots of problems. It certainly, I think the success of London Challenge, because it was very visible to politicians, slightly tricked a lot of people into thinking that a school-led system was going to be much easier around the rest of the country than it in fact proved to be, because they're being very influenced by London head teachers. So absolutely, it causes a lot of issues.
So my partner in Schools North East run a regional schools network that you've kindly come and spoken at before. I'm interested in your views on the use of opposition MPs, positives and negatives, because in our area we've obviously overwhelmingly Labour in the North East of England, but with two notable exceptions, one of which is James Rawson. There's often a push from schools to want to use their local MPs to raise their voice, but a nervousness on my part as to how impactful Sharon Hodgson, say, is as targeting Nicky Morgan, for example. What's your views on that sort of situation?
It's a really good question. So I think it's probably true to say that opposition MPs have fairly little impact on government policy. They can usually get a meeting with the minister. So it's not a complete dead end if there's a really specific issue that isn't particularly political, but just needs to be resolved. They can often get a minister. They will get a reply to a letter, so they can be a useful starting point. But if it's a sort of policy change, then typically ministers, Secretary of State won't be particularly interested in an opposition MP. Often not in their own backbench MPs either. Backbench MPs don't have a huge amount of influence. Going to the Select Committee can be a good way to get something on the agenda. So if they happen to be, if you've got an MP, and I know Nick Dakin's been on the Select Committee, hasn't he? And there's been a few, and Sharon Hodgson's been on the Select Committee. So if they've got that kind of voice, they can influence what the Select Committee is asking about, which will mean that the department have to at least think about it a bit. But it's not a very direct route. No. Okay.
How relevant is this going forward into a school-led system, and how much do you think we're likely to see change in the key policymakers that need to be influenced? Like, do you think that's actually not relevant, and that policy will still continue to be quite centralised? What do you think the regional school commissioner's role is going to be in terms of their body to lobby on policy change?
So, I mean, I suppose in a way the story of education policy over the last 40 years has been this kind of bifurcation of power. So in sort of 1975, I'm being a bit crude, all the power sat with local authorities, and it's kind of half of it's gone to central government and half of it's gone to schools or groups of schools, MATs now. And that change has sort of carried on, and I don't see that changing. So under the sort of school-led system, there's still a lot of power that sits centrally, and there's nowhere else for it to sit really anymore. So power over teacher training or curriculum or assessment, that's all still going to sit in the centre, and if you want to influence those areas, you're absolutely still going to have to go to central government, more so than ever, in fact. If you want to influence the actual dynamic of what's happening in schools in your area, then actually that power is now going to sit with MATs and school commissioners in a way that it might have 5 years ago sat with local authorities. So if the thing that you're trying to influence is that you want to broker a relationship between two schools, or you want to create a partnership between two groups of schools, that's going to have to be done at a local level, and by working with MATs and with regional schools commissioners, and the now hundreds of people that regional schools commissioners are employing. Those offices at a regional level are going to be really important for local issues, but they won't, I don't think, be particularly influential on those kind of national policy issues, I'm guessing, although who knows how the system's going to play out. Yes.
So a really interesting presentation. It'd be interesting getting your thoughts on sort of the use of time, obviously time and sort of money fairly limited for many organisations trying to influence. Where do you see the balance is between sort of people who are currently policymakers now, current Secretary of State, etc., but also given the long-term nature of lobbying, sometimes you can't get change overnight. How much time do you suggest investing in sort of people next one down, so the people who will be the Secretary of State for tomorrow, the future Deputy Prime Ministers, etc., people who probably have slightly easier diaries, but who you can predict will probably be there or thereabouts in maybe 4 or 5 years' time. And obviously there's a trade-off there. We've just been hearing reports on that.
It's a really interesting one because I suppose that you're right that the upside of working with people who are more junior and don't have lots of power right now is that it's much easier to get meetings with them. They will a backbench MP will meet with most people. It's a pretty boring existence and pretty lonely sometimes. So you will get a meeting and you will often can have quite a lot of influence over their thinking because they don't have staff, they don't have advisors. So they will often pick up on ideas if they like them. The downside is you're taking a bit of a punt because no one really knows who's going to end up in power, and it's quite hard to do talent spotting. I mean, I don't think anyone would have guessed even the week before it happened that Nicky Morgan would end up as Secretary of State for Education. She'd never done an education role before, she'd not done a Secretary of State, a select committee role, so that came sort of out of the blue, and that can happen, you know, we may have another Secretary of State in a month or so, and I could not tell you who that would be. It could be any one of about 20 different people. So trying to pick who that would be to work with before is tricky. However, you do have MPs who decide they're going to be interested in a subject. So you do have some MPs who education is their thing, and it's definitely worth engaging with them because even if they don't end up in the department, they probably will end up in the select committee, or they will end up doing some kind of role that's education focused at some point. So it is definitely worth engaging with that kind of role. Yeah.
Just say something about the Education Select Committee and its degree of influence, and as a supplementary, since we're talking about Parliament, could you say something about the kind of what the boundaries between something you might call ideology and policy, in terms of trying to work out which you have to accept as givens, and which you might think it's worth endeavouring to influence?
Okay, so the Select Committee, it depends a lot on who's chair.
So say the current chair.
So the current chair is someone who I think is only fairly recently started and hasn't really yet scared the government enough to have to make them really sit up and pay attention. I think Graham Stewart, who was the previous one and did it for quite a few years, for most of the last Parliament, was in that position early on, but he got to a position where he grew his reputation and he got the media on side with thinking he was a good thing. So he made his inquiries quite a big deal. And whilst it didn't always lead to policy change, at least it made the government sit up and think they had to do a reply. They knew they were going to get quite a tough grilling in front of the Select Committee, so they had to at least think through their decision-making process. I'm not sure if I can recall a time when policy was really changed, but certainly messaging was altered and affected by it, and a lot of people got issues raised that probably wouldn't otherwise have been done. I think it's probably too early to tell with the current chair, but they can be quite powerful if they pick on the right topic and they have the right chair. The line between ideology and policy making. I suppose it goes back to this first comment I made around the fact you have lots of different power bases and they don't have the same ideology. So you actually have lots of different ideologies operating within any given government. The coalition was even more so because you had Nick Clegg, who had a set of beliefs that were really very different to Nick Gibbs, say, and yet both of them were making policy, and both of them had a kind of right to do that. So you'd get things that seemed very contradictory to everybody else because they were coming from different ideological points of view. So I suppose it's a question of finding the person who comes closest to your ideological position and working on them. And bolstering their position within those kinds of different competing power bases. I don't want to make it sound too Game of Thrones. It's not. It's people more or less do get on with each other, but people obviously don't all agree with each other on these issues. Chris.
I think it was the third tip about going with the grain. You were talking about Graham Duncan saying the right to succeed. How did Graham know that what the government was interested in was these social investment bonds. So I'm just thinking, I didn't even know they were a thing, never mind that they were a thing government cared about. So how do you figure out, how do you learn what it is that the people you need to influence care about?
It's not easy. I mean, I think it goes back to you have to read a lot and read between the lines, and you have to talk to a lot of people. He talked to a lot of people before he even got to the point where he wrote down what his idea was going to be, and he used, I guess, the connections that he had to make sure he could talk to those people. It's not obvious, this stuff. It's interesting. One of the things that I find at Teach First is that a lot of new employees who haven't necessarily worked in education come to me and say, is there a guide to how the education system works so I can learn more about it? And there isn't. There is no book or pamphlet that will explain anymore how the education system works. It's really, really complicated, and there's people all over the place doing different roles, and that you just have to learn it, and it takes a lot of time. I have thought about writing that book because it needs to be done, but yeah. But it is a real problem, actually, that there isn't a simple guide to how all this stuff works. So if you're new to it, it's just going to take you a lot of time to figure it all out, and you just have to talk to a lot of people.
Take back to that sports question about good policy, because it feels slightly, and that's been completely the wrong word, because some people have very good connections and can get themselves to a centre. They're not necessarily the people with the best policy ideas. And is there, something in your sort of thesis that might help give some advantage to those people that actually know more and have a better take on things? That was my first point. The second one, particularly, I think is particularly worrying at the moment because of I thought your points about Twitter are really, really telling, that they have to go there because they don't really like the traditional routes down to the grassroots. So there's less understanding of the system as a whole, which might be, I'm guessing, so I may be wrong, which might be why they misunderstood the number of both governing bodies and head teachers out there that didn't want to be forced into academies, because they spend their entire lives talking to mats of 20 or more schools, so they've got a very skewed view.
Yeah.
So how do we make sure that that doesn't work to the detriment of the system?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's particularly bad in education, actually, this disconnect between what the people politicians have access to and the sort of, if you like, the experts on the front line. And I think one reason, but certainly not the only reason, but one reason is that it's one of the few areas that doesn't have any professional bodies. And I know the College of Teaching is a highly contentious topic, people have issues with it, but it is true that there are no professional bodies in education. Government doesn't get on very well with unions, especially Tory governments. They won't talk to them very much, and if you're not going to talk to them, where is your opportunity to have representation made to you about what's going on the ground? There just isn't much opportunity for it. Probably the most influential professional unions are the head teacher unions. They do have influence, and particularly NAHT over the last few years. But they're obviously representing head teachers. That's a particular interest group rather than the whole system. So I think there's something around professional bodies.
Do you know if Used to Be Centre Forum is interested in doing any of that work in terms of taking the pulse of the front line?
So this is a reference to the new sort of education-only think tank that's been created by what used to be Centre Forum, which David Laws is chairing. Yeah, there's definitely potential there for them to do that kind of representation, to collect a collection of views and give them to ministers. But yeah, it was really hard. It was really hard for me to get a room of teachers when I was an advisor there. I did get rooms of teachers together, but it wasn't easy, and there was no formal mechanism for doing that. I just had to go and do it myself. So I think I do think that's one way, but not the only way of making it better.
How do you think, in your experience, advisors deal with a situation where a minister comes to them with a sort of grand plan or an idea that's come to them from the ether, and you may well know the research base that in the area that they want to develop policy in, and you know that it doesn't look good for the thing that they want to initiate. How do you handle that, not least with a minister who who may like to minimise
Well, obviously,
the value of experts.
well, obviously, I failed in doing that quite often. Yeah, I still remember the morning when I was told we were going to send Bibles to everybody in the country. That was not a good day. I think the way I found that the best way I found to do it was not to say. So the civil service way of doing it is to say, here are 110 reasons why you can't do this. It's against EU regulations, which is why Michael Gove is so against the EU. It would cost too much money, there's not enough people in this building to support it, etc. So they'll give you a list of no reasons. And that doesn't go well on the whole, because ministers just get really frustrated that they're being blocked and they feel like they're being Sir Humphrey'd. The best way I found was to say, okay, I understand what you're trying to do, this isn't the way to do it, but this is the way to do it instead. So you give them a solution rather than just telling them, no, you can't have this. If the thing they're trying to do is crazy, then you have a problem. But actually, usually, the thing they're trying to do is quite sensible. They've just picked on the wrong way to get there. And it's about finding a different route to that solution, I guess. A good example, that GCSE thing is a good example. Like, you don't need to change the name of these things. I know where you want to get to. You want harder GCSEs. You can just do this by reforming GCSEs.
Just one thing that's been mentioned, and I'm concerned about the influence of, is shadow education sectors. So what sort of relationship exists between an education secretary and her shadow?
It depends on the people involved. Sometimes they pretend to dislike each other but actually get on fairly well. Sometimes they really hate each other. Michael Gove and Ed Balls really hated each other, and that wasn't synthetic.
Are there formal opportunities for
They won't. There isn't formal. There are no formal opportunities for them to meet. There's very little engagement between parties. You might have somebody who's more sympathetic to your view, who's in the other party, that you might want to work with. So Andrew Adonis came in and talked to Michael quite a lot about policy, because they were obviously in a much more similar place, even though he's still Labour. But the actual Secretary of State, the actual Shadow Secretary, there's rarely much in the way of interaction there. I'm trying to think if there's any counter-examples, but I can't think of any.
Examples of where a well-placed question from a shadow education secretary is forced rethink or
Not really, because they don't get the kind of 6 you see in parliamentary in PMQs. They only get 2, and you can't build any. It's very easy to bat away a question, to be honest, in parliament. Yeah.
Something that's worth
Yeah.
on either side of the chamber.
So if you do want to go for influence in parliamentary terms, actually having the House of Lords is often a better place to go to, because there's no government majority in the House of Lords. So if I think back to the first Academies Act back in 2010, the changes in that act came from Liberal Democrats in the House of Lords, who sort of forced various changes to that act because it wasn't going to get through the Lords otherwise.
But that's reactive, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you want to amend.
Yes. If you want to actually push the agenda, then actually Parliament isn't the place to go. That sounds really bad, but it's true.
So much for parliament.
Indeed.
Actually, I thought you were going to say, we haven't mentioned, I thought you were going to say HMCI, because obviously that's another big power base, and I think when you were talking about who's got the power, actually we have centralised huge amounts. And okay, the RSCs are fairly senior civil servants, but they're not massive. I mean, I think different with David Carter, he's clearly a very important player within the DFE, but I think surely HMCI, how does, and I know there've been issues, haven't there, and we're now about to enter a new scenario. So how much influence do you think HMCI has had over policy?
They can have huge influence. The current one hasn't had very much influence because over the last few years, because he's deliberately fallen out with the government. Well, I just find it so hilarious that 3 years ago people were saying he's the government's poodle. I mean, he couldn't be further away from the truth. But I think the new HMCI, when she starts, she's certainly going to be independent. She's very independently minded, but she's much more keen to engage with everybody and less sort of aggressive. So I would imagine that she would have quite a lot of influence over the DFE, certainly in previous iterations of Ofsted that's been true. Christine Gilbert had a lot of influence over Ed Balls, for example. So it can happen. Definitely. I have to stop now because I've reached my time limit. But thank you very much.